Hello everyone and welcome to CRTV 131. Filmmaking in the late 60s and or even the mid 60s and into the early Stanley Kubrick. And we've already looked at a little bit of The Shining. And later on we will do Full Metal Jacket when we talk about movies from the Vietnam War. Kubrick was a real auteur, and he worked in lots and lots of different genres, as we'll see when we put up our nice list. He couldn't get into film school. He was sort of looking at NYU, and I don't know if it was the cost or whatever. But when he was even still in high school, he was taking photography, taking photos for national magazines, for Look magazine, things like that. So he had a pretty good photography career going, even in high school, and making money for all of that. That was one of the big photo journals of the time. Look and Life were the two. They were big, oversized, probably 14 by 9, something like that, big magazines, and it was a real honor for a photographer, any photographer, nature photographer, social photographer, journalism photographer, to get photos in one of these magazines, just like it would have been for National Geographic, or even for fashion with a magazine like Vogue. So it was pretty good, and he did that when he was still in high school. He morphed from that into documentary films. He actually did some what they call industrial work, doing work for I think he made a film about the Longshoremen's Union and things like that, which does my heart proud. That's what I did for many years. I worked at the Department of Education, and I worked at a medical center, Long Beach Memorial Medical Center, doing all sorts of videos and things, and flying around in helicopters and looking at the insides of people's bodies and all that. And I certainly didn't progress the way Kubrick did, that's for darn sure. But it's kind of cool that we both began in industrial videos. And he was mostly self-taught. The low light lenses and things that he had adapted and stuff so that he could shoot in candlelight. So he could operate the camera quite well. As a matter of fact, he wrote scripts, produced his movies, or co-produced his movies, and of course directed. Really was an auteur of the truest sense. So here's a list of his films. I think I have them all. No, I don't see Barry Lyndon in there. Okay, maybe that's one or two. Maybe there's one or two, but anyway, that's a pretty good list. And what I want you to get out of this is that he worked in many genres. That's the main thing. I'm not going to ask something like that on the test. Don't worry about that. But he did film noir, he did war, historical epic, a black comedy, sci-fi, 2001, war with Full Metal Jacket, dystopian future with Clockwork Orange. So a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And that's great. Some film makers don't jump around from genres and things like that, and they're still wonderful directors. They're still auteurs. Somebody like Martin Scorsese rarely ventures out of the R-rated gangster world, and that's fine because they're brilliant movies. Quentin Tarantino rarely ventures out of his R-rated kinds of movies. Sometimes he goes back into the past with something like a Western or a war movie, but most of his movies are rather violent and R-rated, and with lots and lots of dialogue. And that's okay, right? That's okay. But there are other directors like Kubrick, and we'll name a few others as we go through the course, that sort of jump around a little of this and a little of that, and it's really amazing that you can that you could excel in such different ways. Some directors, I have to note, like Steven Spielberg, have tried and sort of exceeded their reach. A number of directors in the early 1970s, and we'll talk about this when we talk about bombs these wonderful filmmakers churning out their wonderful movies like Jaws and The Last Picture Show and movies like that, and MASH. And they overreached. They tried to make a musical and failed horribly. Tried to make a comedy and failed horribly. Even the amazing Steven Spielberg is in that group that sort of tried to do a comedy. He said, "I'll never do a comedy again. I can't do it." And other directors tried to do musicals, of all things. And it's a lot harder than it looks. It's a lot harder than it looks. So Kubrick he made comedies for sure, probably one of the funniest movies ever made, Dr. Strangelove. But he didn't try a musical, and musicals are not as easy and light-hearted as they might seem. Something like Sing in the Rain is a very difficult task. Okay, so let's dive in. We're going to skip some of this stuff. This is film noir. It's quite good. It jumps around in time. It is non-linear, and very interesting film in the 1950s. Paths of Glory is seen as one of the all-time great war movies. It's set in World War I in the trenches. If you've seen 1917, you might want to check out Paths of Glory, but it is considered by a lot of people as one of the 2 or 3 best war movies ever. Spartacus was not his project. He was brought on because he worked with Kirk Douglas in Paths of Glory, and Kirk Douglas was the star and the producer and was not happy with the direction of the film, and he got this young kid, just I think he was like 31, 32, to do Spartacus. And during that bloated era, Kubrick managed to make a big, giant movie that's really, really good. And again, that's not so easy to do. There are lots of big budget movies set in ancient times. They used to call them sword and sandal movies with Ben-Hur and Cleopatra and all that. But Spartacus turned out to be a really good film, even though it wasn't written and produced and wasn't really a Kubrick film. But he did it. Lolita is it's amazing that it even got made, because it's the story of a middle-aged man falling in love with a 12-year-old girl. Yes, and it was rather notorious and rather racy when the book was written in the 1950s. And Kubrick knew that it was notorious and all that, and he thought that would maybe bring an audience into the movie. He actually got the novelist, Vladimir Nabokov, to co-write the script. They made it much more of a comedy. They went much lighter. They made it much more of a comedy. And the girl, Sue Lyon, who was cast to play Lolita, I think she was 13 or 14 when she made the movie, and she looks much older. She really looks maybe 16 or 17. She looks much older. So it's not quite as icky, to use a word. It's not quite as icky as you might think, since they played up the comedy, and the girl wasn't quite the child of the novel. And the novel was written as a satire, as a comedy, so it wasn't written for prurient interest or anything like that. So he was getting known, right? He was getting known. He had done these 4 movies, and his next project, he picked Dr. Strangelove based on a book. He wanted to make a movie about nuclear war, a comedy about nuclear war. Okay, so let's dive in to Dr. Strangelove. So yes, a black comedy is a comedy about morbid subject matter, about the funeral industry or nuclear war or the plague or something like that, and you turn it into a comedy, and that's what they call a black comedy. And for persecuted peoples, enslaved peoples, and so on, sometimes comedy or humor is really the only way to deal with the situation. And psychologists tell us this as well. So Kubrick, at the height or the depth of the Cold War, and the Cold War means it was not a shooting war. Nobody was firing guns or launching missiles, but it was a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the West, including England and France and Germany, NATO countries. So it was a Cold War, the Iron Curtain, all that sort of thing. the Soviet Union had installed puppet governments in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and places like that. And we had our missiles aimed at them, and our planes. Actually, we didn't have that many intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, back then. But we flew giant B-52 bombers. They would be constantly in the air, 24/7. They could be refueled in mid-air, and when they came down, others could go up, constantly patrolling and sort of pushing the boundaries and so on. And so did they, right? So did the Russians, the Soviet Union. So Kubrick decides, he decides to make a comedy about it, and he got some wonderful other writers, Terry Southern, who co-wrote Candy, another satire, and they set it in 3 different scenes. I've linked, generally in this class, I spend a lot of time on Strangelove and 2001, and later on we will get to Clockwork Orange. But I dive pretty deep into those. Films. So I would bring a DVD in, and we would look at lengthy sections. But luckily, good old YouTube has most of what I would be showing. Not exactly, but most of what I'd be showing. So it's not too frustrating for me to present all this to you. So please check out and enjoy. The first scene that we're going to see is the General Secretary, Miss Scott, I think it is, and we see her under a sun lamp on a bed in a hotel room. And it's pretty clear that she's not just doing secretarial duties for the general. And she's going to answer the phone, and I usually like to talk about it because the general on the other end of the line is telling the general, the secretary's general, that one of the generals has gone nuts. He has sent his squadron out toward Russia with the codes and all that sort of thing, and he doesn't seem to have any compunction to tell the secretary everything that's going on. She knows him by his first name. That's also kind of interesting. It is played in one long take, and that is fun. George C. Scott is hilarious in this movie. He's just hilarious. He really dominates the film, even though Peter Sellers is in it in 3 different parts. And speaking of Peter Sellers, he played the president, Merkin Muffley. He played the Dr. Strangelove, the former Nazi, who has a syndrome that he can't control his body parts and so on, and his arm keeps giving the Heil Hitler, the Heil sign shooting out, and he can't control his arm and so on. It's a real thing. It's a real thing, people not being able to control that. Since the movie came out, they call it Strangelove syndrome. And Peter Sellers also plays Colonel Mandrake, a British officer who's sort of embedded in the Air Force with the crazy general. Okay, so Peter Sellers, he was going to play a 4th part. He was going to play the bomber pilot as well, who's a Texan. Peter Sellers was great at all these accents, American accent for Muffley and German accent for Strangelove, and his native British accent for Colonel Mandrake. And you might notice these names because they are all double entendre. It's a wonderful French word, and it has sort of a double meaning. Okay, so Buck Turgidson, he's the general, and turgid is to be firm and erect. Okay, get it? Yeah, firm and erect. Jack D. Ripper. Okay, that's kind of an easy one. Bat is his nickname, Bat Guano, and that is feces. That is bird shit. He is bat shit crazy, you might say. Excuse my language, but that's exactly what they're going after. And guano actually makes really good fertilizer. So there are islands in the Caribbean with yards deep in bird guano that have been fought over for all this fertilizer and things like that. You can actually make explosives out of fertilizer and so on too. So anyway, bat, guano, okay, that's a good one. King Kong, okay, we got that. Premier Kiss-Off, okay, that's fun. And Desadsky, there's the Marquis de Sade, and he wrote about bondage and spanking and whipping and all that kind of stuff. And if you speak Spanish or understand Spanish, the La Puta Air Base is a whore or prostitute. So they must have had fun coming up with all of that. And for some, it's going to go over their heads. Not for you, because I just explained it to you. And there is Peter Sellers as Dr. Strangelove. And he is in this wonderful designed room. Let's go back to it again because it's so amazing. It's a wonderful set. When one of our recent presidents was inaugurated, and one of the first things he did after he became president was he wanted to take a tour of the war room. And there is no such war room. That was a set that they built. But it looks so believable and it looks so good and so fantastic. The general said, sorry, Mr. President, that we don't really have a war room that is like that. These look like giant computer screens. They're actually films being projected from the backside. He does that also in 2001. A Space Odyssey, where all the computer screens are supposed to be. There's dozens of film projectors projecting animations and things like that. The guy that did this set, he also worked on set. His name's Ken Adam. He also worked on sets for James Bond movies, which is pretty cool too as well. And you can see that he's perfect for that, right? He's really perfect for that. So I've got a scene where the general talks about our precious bodily fluids, and he is paranoid, and he is worried about fluoride in the water, fluoridation, and that's a real thing too. There really were people in Orange County, the John Birch Society, a very, very conservative group of people, and they were concerned that fluoride was going to be somehow mind control from the Soviet Union instead of just halting tooth decay or helping to avoid tooth decay. Fluoride, right? They have fluoride in our toothpaste. So that's a real thing, right? There really were people in this country, and they were worried about that. So he's going to talk about water and only drinking rainwater and distilled water and all that. There's a wonderful phone call between the two presidents, and it's going to sound like, at first it's going to sound like a parent talking to a child. Okay, our general did a silly thing, he's going to say. And that's how you talk to a child. What happened, with 9/11? Well, they did a silly thing, and they flew their airplanes into the building. And if you're trying to talk to a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child, you don't want to really describe too realistically what's going on. And you say, well, he did a silly thing. He went and so on. Muffley is talking to the other president. Kiss-Off. No, not Kiss-Off. What's his name anyway? I almost forgot. We have to go back to President Merkin Muffley, because that is one of the more bizarre double entendre names, because a merkin is a real thing. A merkin is a real thing, yes. I would ask, raise your hand if you know what a merkin is. A merkin is a pubic wig. Yes, that's what a merkin is. It's a pubic wig. And it's very obscure, but I don't know. It's French. You can count on the French to come up with some weird thing. Maybe it's Italian. But anyway, it comes from the Middle Ages even. Not the Middle Ages. It comes from 1700s. And Strangelove, of course, that's fun. Mandrake is a poisonous root. Okay, so we got these 3 names also with the double entendre meanings. We have a scene of the survival kit contents, and that is fun as well. It's going to start off with what seems to be regular survival kit contents with pills and things for being alert and stuff, and maybe if they were shot down and they had to make their way out of the Soviet Union, maybe some money and that sort of thing. And then it delves into chocolates and nylons and all sorts of stuff like that. That is really just ridiculous. And at the very end of this survival kit contents checklist, the pilot says, "Shoot, a feller can have a pretty good weekend in Vegas with all that stuff." And if you look closely, because we've linked to it, if you look closely, his lips go off just a little bit. And if I didn't say anything, you wouldn't notice. But originally, he says a feller could have a pretty weekend in Dallas with all that stuff. But this movie came out in the spring of 1964, just a couple of months after President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. And so they thought it would probably be a good idea to not even have any reminders of Dallas for that. And we have the bomb run, which is fantastic. And you'll recognize it. It's a very iconic scene. Our cowboy trying to fix the Bombay doors. They are attacked by the Soviet Union, and some missiles go off near them and put some of their communications out. So when all the rest of the planes, the bombers, are called back with the recall code, they don't get the message, and they're the lone plane heading into Russia to drop nuclear weapons on them because they have lost their communication system. And also their Bombay doors won't open, so he's going to have to go in there and fix the Bombay doors. Puts the audience in a very odd position of hoping that he can fix it so that the Bombay doors open. But that's going to start World War III. And maybe that's not such a good idea. So it's very odd that it's presented in this sort of, countdown way. We're almost there, 3 miles out, and he's trying manically to fix the Bombay doors. And then we will see Dr. Strangelove, really brilliant performance by Peter Sellers. He's in a wheelchair. He has the arm that keeps giving the Heil salute and so on. And we had German scientists. Matter of fact, one of the main ways we got to the moon was Wernher von Braun, and he was a Nazi rocket scientist. He helped develop the rockets that bombed London, the V-2 rockets that bombed London. He swears he was just, following orders and so on, like a good German. But when the troops were coming from the east, from Russia, and the troops were coming from the west, the United States, he led a number of scientists to be captured by the Americans. And the Americans knew his strategic value pretty fast in rocketry and all that sort of thing. He was more or less forgiven. It's really kind of odd, this Nazi that helped develop rockets to bomb cities and so on. I mean, he admitted to it and so on, but they didn't make a big deal of it when he was working at NASA. Anyway, so we had some pretty good German nuclear people working in nuclear stuff and rocket scientists and all that, and so they're having a little bit of fun with all of that as well. And toward the end, there's a scene where Strangelove is going to talk about that when the bombs do go off. Yeah, spoiler alert, the bombs go off, and he's talking about going into deep mine shafts, caves and mine shafts and stuff for 100 years, and building a city in there, and surviving, and then after 100 years we can come out and continue whatever, ruling the world. Well, as odd as that sounds, it's a real thing too. In West Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C., there really is a mountain. It has really been hollowed out. There is a hospital and apartments and all sorts of stuff in there, and it is specifically for the president and the Supreme Court and members of Congress. And every once in a while, when administrations change, I think an Obama advisor or cabinet member said, well, I can't get into the Magic Mountain anymore, right? I've given up my pass. my passcode, and it's only for members of the current government so that they can survive and keep the government going. And it sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous, but it's a real thing. A lot of this stuff is real. The whole fluoride and all that stuff. The hotline, there's a direct line from the American president to the Russian president. All that stuff. All that is a real thing. Kubrick and his team did a really good bit of research. There was a Stanley Kubrick exhibit at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and I went a few years ago. They had some wonderful stuff, some of the sets from Clockwork Orange and all that. This is the amazing, this is one of his favorite cameras that they had there, and there were some famous lenses and things that he used. One of them, the candlelight lens, and from Barry Lyndon, that could it was adapted, and the shutter and so on, and it could shoot in candlelight, which in 1975 was very, very hard to do. Now today with digital technology, they can shoot in candlelight and so on. But way back in 1975, Kubrick didn't want to fake it. Normally you'd show people walking around with candles and so on, and then out of the shot there would be lights and so on, to bring up the level of the light. And Kubrick wanted to do it, all the way. So they had this extremely, what's called a fast lens, a very sensitive lens. Anyway, there's that. That was kind of cool. There's the survival kit there's a Russian phrase book, a Holy Bible. There's all these pills and everything that the soldiers are going to be given. So these are all props. And another odd thing, when people in the military saw the B-52 bomber, they had worried about a security leak because they built the bomber and dropping the bombs and arming the nuclear warhead, all that stuff that has to happen before the bomb is dropped. They got it pretty right. They were just sort of guessing, right? This is the way planes are and all that, and they just made it all up with all these switches and codes and all that kind of stuff. And apparently people in the military thought that there was a security leak, but there was no such thing. And this is from The Shining. If you remember The Shining, I did link to a scene in The Shining. There we go. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. That's the typewriter and everything from The Shining. Okay, enough of that. Let's get back to Stanley Kubrick, and we are going to dive into 2001. And just this summer I read a book on the making of 2001. It's amazing. I probably go on all day, but I won't. And if we use consensus and perspective, we have the greatest sci-fi film of all time. And I mention that, and it's not for everyone's taste. It's very intellectual and so on. If you've seen Interstellar, with the black holes and all that kind of stuff and time and all that, it's not easy action sci-fi stuff. And it's very scientifically rigorous and so on. And so is 2001. And 2001 is kind of spacey out there, with the space aliens and intelligent life from beyond and all that kind of stuff. And it is not a CGI movie. It's not full of CGI at all. This is 1968. These are models and things. They had to shoot them frame by frame models. And so the reason I bring it up is that you don't need real high-tech CGI to make a really good sci-fi movie, right? If you have a great idea and a great script, then you can have a great movie. If you can pull off the effects, and the effects look fantastic today. And I've linked to a number of scenes. And they hold up really well. It doesn't look like some 1950s drive-in movie or anything like that. It holds up very, very, very well. There is a famous edit, one of the most famous edits of all time, when one of the, I don't know what they are, Australopithecus or something, one of the ape men, pre-hominids, and the aliens, which we never see. We never see the aliens, but they leave a monolith. It has a certain dimensions, 1 by 3 by 5 by 9, I think it is. And one of the aliens is sort of inspired. What the idea for the aliens is they're going to maybe push development ahead, maybe by thousands of years, but they are going to think about using tools and fire, right? And that's going to, they're going to have more protein in their diet once they can kill and capture animals and things, cook the food so that our digestive system doesn't have to work so hard digesting, and that's going to allow for brain growth and all that good kind of stuff. So that's the idea. The aliens are there. They're pushing the pre-humans along, and after they use it as a weapon on another tribe, okay, this is the very first weapon, he's going to exultingly throw it into the air, and while it's spinning in the air, it's going to cut to a satellite. It's called the Million Year Edit, and it's a match cut so that they're kind of in the same position and so on. And then we are in this scene right here, and we're going to hear the Blue Danube, a beautiful waltz by Johann Strauss. And Kubrick was just playing it while he was editing the film. They were going to have an original score and all that, and he kind of liked the way this classical music worked in the film. It's very graceful and very beautiful, and we're going to see this commercial. It's just a commercial ship. It's like TWA. Of course, TWA is not around anymore, but it's going to go in and it's going to match the rotation. It's going to start spinning and match the rotation and land and drop the passengers off to this not quite all the way built space wheel. And George Lucas is going to use a little bit of that with the Death Star that's not quite all the way finished. And like I say, they did lots of work with scientists and so on. They did research for years. He got Arthur C. Clarke, the famed sci-fi author, to co-write the story with him over a couple of years. And a satellite like this spinning is going to give artificial gravity. And I keep wondering why we haven't done this yet, because every time somebody comes back from space after being up for months, everybody's concerned about their bone mass and muscles, and they practically have to be carried off because they've been weightless for a year, and their muscles have atrophied and all that. And I think, well, why don't we figure out some kind of a way, right? So they're sort of spinning, and basically their feet and their heads are facing toward the center, right? So that's centrifugal force, and they create an artificial gravity. So this wonderful set, we see it sort of curves. We see people in there, and as it goes, we can see this long, gentle curve up to the ceiling, and basically you can walk all the way around with your feet pointed outward and your head pointed inward. Okay, anyway, I'm sure there's a reason. Maybe it's as simple as cost, but it is a thing, and science knows it and understands it, and all the whole rest of it. And so this film has one of the great villains of all time, and it's a computer, Hal, and Hal is running the ship and speaks with this wonderful voice. It's very calm, almost effeminate, and in this very sort of calming sort of a way. And Hal is going to make a mistake, and computers don't make mistakes. He's going to say part of the dish, I think, on the outside of their ship. That's not their ship, but he's going to say it's going to fail, so they bring it in, receiver, something like that. They bring it in, they test it, and it seems fine, and they become concerned that the computer is making a mistake, and the computer is pretty much running everything on the ship. What happens is they have found another monolith on the moon. Present day, or in 2001, they found another monolith on the moon. That monolith emits a signal aimed toward Jupiter. So the Americans figure we better head to Jupiter and see what this is all about. And so we have 2 astronauts running things, and then I think 4 or 6 more astronauts in deep sleep hibernation. So Hal is going to, so they're worried and they get in a space pod. They say that they're going to check something out, and they go in and they start talking about shutting Hal down. And as it becomes evident in the middle of the conversation, Hal can read lips, and he knows they're going to shut him down. So he turns off all of the survival things for all the astronauts in hibernation, and one of the astronauts that is outside the ship is killed, and we are just left with Dave. Dave versus Hal. It's a wonderful scene. It's very chilling. He left his helmet. He ran out so fast to save his partner. He left his helmet in, and he has to get in through the airlock. And he gets in, and the whole scene of him dismantling Hal and turning off his memory is just chilling to hear a computer saying, "Dave, stop. Stop, Dave. I feel my mind going, Dave." Wonderful stuff, just wonderful stuff. This is a great scene. I've linked to all that stuff. I'm afraid, right? A computer saying, "I'm afraid, Dave." Then we go beyond the infinite, right? We've never met the space aliens, but he in his ship, there's another monolith floating in space out there by Jupiter, and Dave goes into what looks to be a sort of Stargate, and as the time might say, it's very trippy. It's very trippy. So at that time, 1968, there were lots of people taking psychedelics, whether just marijuana or the stronger stuff, LSD. And to take LSD was known as going on a trip or tripping. So the advertisers, the studio, is really astounding that they would co-opt that and say the ultimate trip, right? They're kind of saying, go ahead, go, take your LSD, see our movie, you'll love it. So they marketed it to that audience, the youth audiences, as the ultimate trip. This is a real poster. I didn't make this up or Photoshop it or anything. It's really amazing. And there's the Star Child in the middle. If you watch the movie, you'll see what that's all about. So going through the Stargate, it is quite a while. I don't know, 10, 12 minutes, something like that. And if you've taken your LSD at the right time, then you will be going on the ultimate trip. There were stories of people going, who was it? John Lennon said, I see it every week. So anyway, wonderful movie. It's 52 years old this year. They had some 50th anniversary stuff a couple years ago. And like I say, it's not for everyone. A lot of people want a very direct answer. You know, what's it all about? Where are the aliens? What's the whole thing? And what's the Star Child and all the whole rest of it? And Kubrick and Clark decided to leave it a little bit more open. And it actually started, a lot of the critics really didn't like the movie. There were a few, but a lot of the critics really didn't like the movie. And it took a little while, and the youth audience kept it going. It was not a bomb. Matter of fact, it was the top grossing movie for 1968. The studio poured a lot of money into the movie. They were definitely afraid that they might have had a flop. Kubrick started right after Dr. Strangelove in 1964, and it came out in 1968. So 4 years in the making, lots of prep work and making the space wheel and things like that. Let's take a look at that. We see a scene on the craft that is going to Jupiter, and he is jogging, and he's going to sort of jog up the wall and across the ceiling and back again. And, is an amazing scene. Audiences, how did they do that? Remember, this is pre-CGI, pre all that. But he was in a giant hamster wheel for the most part, right? He was always at the bottom, and the whole thing was spinning. But depending on where you place the camera and so on, it looks like he's going to go up the ceiling and back and around again. At a couple of times, the floor would sort of open up, and that's where the camera would be, as the whole thing is spinning. The camera would be down there somewhere with the floor opened up, and so he was the only one in there. And I think we see some of the astronauts hibernating and so on that are going to die later on. Giant set, I don't know, it was 50 feet high that they built for it, but it worked. It worked amazingly. It worked brilliantly. I can't remember who came up with it, but it worked quite well. And we get to see these. It looked like somebody got in a time machine and went off into the future. 33 years into the future, from 68, 67 to 2001. It really did. It looked like the future. It looked like 2052, right? What is 2052, 53 going to feel like for us, right? We can only imagine the future, and that's what was going on. And it really looked like somebody went into a time machine and shot all this stuff. There's a wonderful scene on the spaceship that's taking one of the scientists to the satellite. And the stewardess has grip sole shoes. We see her walking up a ceiling and back and around. We see a pen floating in the air, and she grabs it out of the air and sticks it back into the scientist's pocket. And lots of wonderful stuff like that done, what they call with practical effects. And, when you have something that the audience says, how did they do that? Okay, how did they do that? Then that's really something. And 2001 has all that. And over the years, its fame grew and grew, and critics and critics associations and so on. 30, 40 years after it came out, it was one of the top 10 movies of all times, according to the Sight and Sound poll that only comes out every 10 years. And then it ended up, I think, in number 2 or number 3 after Citizen Kane. And so it took a while, right? It was a little misunderstood, thought was maybe a little bit much when it first came out. Young audiences loved it and adapted to it very fast, but the critical establishment took 30, 40 years. But now it is seen as one of the top 3 or 4 films of all time. Okay, anyway, there's that wonderful stuff, the wonderful space wheel. We had never been that far from the Earth in '68. Not till Christmas did we send a ship to circle the moon and not land. So they did pretty good work. They guessed pretty well what that was going to be like. And the wonderful trip scene through the Stargate. And our last film today from Stanley Kubrick is a very controversial film from 1971. We're in the very early going. Remember, the rating system only came out at the end of 68, 69, so this is just a couple years in. This originally was an X-rated film for sex and violence, and from Stanley Kubrick, 1971. And on the surface, it seems like Alex and his droogs, his friends, are having a good old time, and they're fighting, and they're having sex, and these amazing costumes that they're wearing with the bowler hats and the codpieces and the jackboots and all that kind of stuff, and driving around and all that, and it's pretty awful, scary stuff, right? Home invasion, rape, and all that, but it's presented with this electronic soundtrack and these bright sets and all of that, and it seems like it's just this sort of gang kind of movie. But the deeper we get into the film, we're going to see it's really about free will. And like I said, I have linked to a number of scenes from Clockwork Orange, some of the fighting and that sort of thing. And Alex is going to overstep the boundaries of being a leader of his droogs. And I mentioned droogs. I mentioned that once before. They're are highly stylized sets, costumes, electronic music, and also we get these new words, right? Gang speak and so on, and Viddy this, and my Gulliver, and the old in out, and things like that. So it's wonderful sets, set designs. They go to the Korova Milk Bar where they ingest sort of a mescaline amphetamine sort of a drink that gets them all wired up and ready for fighting and blood, and probably can feel no pain or anything like that. And Alex is going to overstep for his gang, and they are going to be rather unhappy about all that and set him up the next time they do a home invasion to get caught by the police. And he will go off to prison for years, even though he's really a teenager. And a lot of movies. I hate to pick on Martin Scorsese, but if we see The Wolf of Wall Street, there's lots of bad behavior, lots of drugs, lots of prostitutes, and this and that, and money and yachts, and it looks like they're having a pretty darn good time, breaking the law, stealing and losing people's money, all that sort of thing. And he doesn't get caught until pretty much the end of the movie. We never really see him in prison or anything like that. And that's kind of a mixed message, right? It almost seems like the message is don't get caught more than don't be bad. It almost seems like it's don't get caught. And there are a lot of movies like that, showing lots of bad behavior, let's say. And in Clockwork Orange, we're barely halfway into the movie, right? And he gets caught, and we're going to see how awful prison is. So Kubrick's got a different message. We're not just going to go through this and have him at the very end of the movie. And he's in for years, but the authorities are going to present him with a possible early release scenario, and he will be conditioned, operant conditioning, they call it. And they're going to give him drugs that are going to make him feel sick, and they're going to show him movies of people being violent and forcing themselves on women and fighting and lots of blood. And the idea is he will associate all of his former bad behavior with this awful, awful feeling that the drugs are giving him, right? They're going to condition him. And it's a wonderful scene where they pin his eyes open and all of that. And then he's going to be set out into society again, but he will not have free will, right? Even if he wants to, even if he wants to defend himself legitimately from harm, he will be on his hands and knees retching and feeling sick, and he can't. And certainly he can't commit crimes or anything like that. Now, this is a tough call for society. It's a very big problem for society because we know that certain criminals are going to be recidivists. They're going to commit crimes all over again. And whether it's burglary, okay, it's not good, but it's not the worst. But with child predators, right? We know they are sick, they are not cured, and they are going to go back out into society because they have done their time. They have paid their debt to society. They have been in prison for those years that the law says that you must pay for if you commit those crimes. And then they're going to be let back out into society. And statistics show that it's a high probability that they're going to commit those same crimes again against children. What are we going to do? We can't keep them in prison forever because that's not where the law is. And castrate? Really? What are you going to do? And there are no answers. There are no really good answers. I don't think it's a good answer. And that's what the book and that's what the film are sort of questioning, right? What are we going to do? We know Alex, if he got out regularly, he'd go back to his fighting and robbing and raping and all that awful kind of stuff. He would not be cured in any way. But the only way around that for this movie, anyway, is to take away his free will. So it's a very thoughtful movie. There's a lot on it. Alex, we hear his thoughts, right? He is talking to us in voiceover. Oh, my friends, your humble narrator, he calls himself. Oh, my brothers and sisters, right? He's talking directly to us in the audience. like we're pals. This awful guy, right? He's funny, kind of good looking. He loves Beethoven, right? He loves Beethoven and so on. And he's just reprehensible, okay? And that is a real tough call for the audience. And film after film in the 1960s and 70s were kind of asked to identify with not very nice people. Maybe it's Michael Corleone as a gangster. We've got Alex here, and lots of other bad behavior or illegal behavior or whatever, even Easy Rider, things like that. And these are anti-heroes. We'll talk about anti-heroes. Jack Nicholson did such a wonderful job playing an anti-hero through the years. But in 1971, Kubrick really put his finger on the pulse of, I don't know, America or the world. He shot it in Great Britain. There were some copycat crimes, and Kubrick had the power in his contract to pull the film from distribution. So unless you knew somebody in America or something like that, the movie was not available to be seen. They didn't show it in movie theaters and VHS and so on, or not available for the longest time because Kubrick did not want copycat crimes of guys dressing up and all that sort of thing. So Clockwork Orange, like I say, a very notorious movie. It was rated X when it came out. Today it's R. Standards have changed a bit. But rape is hard to look at. It really is. Even if he's singing in the rain and dancing, which he does, sort of making fun of the whole thing. It's hard to look at. So you have been warned that there are some rough scenes in there. But it's an amazing film. It's a brilliant film, and it's a great looking film. There's a scene where Alex goes into a record shop to buy, and records look a little bit different. And we have some names of some odd groups that groups in the 1980s actually took their names from some of the fake groups that Kubrick put in the record store. But if you look while Alex is standing at the counter, down below there is the soundtrack album to 2001: A Space Odyssey. So if we're in the classroom, I usually put my laser pointer on that to let people know. And you can look for that. I think I have that scene there. And it's a wonderful film. Yeah, Kubrick. Fair amount of time on Kubrick. We'll lighten things up for just a little bit here to finish off with Hal Ashby. With Harold and Maude. This is also from the early 1970s. We have most of the decade. This is from very early the decade, 1970, 1971. And Hal is very revisionist, right? Taking something like a romance, a love story, and revising it, right? And here we have our 20-year-old Harold and our 79-year-old Maude in a love story. Harold is a very twisted young man. They meet at a funeral, not anybody that either of them know, but they both have a fascination with funerals, and you will learn Maude's reason later on. And it's sort of a role reversal. She's kind of like the hippie chick. She wants to free the canaries from the cages so they can fly free, and she wants to drink Oat Star tea and travel the world and talk to the monks up in Nepal, all sorts of, you almost expect her to have long hair and beads and all that. And Harold is kind of the uptight one, wearing a suit coat and a tie and so on. And he keeps staging these elaborate suicides. And as we learn into the movie that he was in an accident in class, in a chemistry class. There was something that went wrong, and Harold got lots of attention. He got lots of attention. How are you? And all of that. And he kind of liked that. He wasn't getting much attention from his mother. So he goes off to stage these amazing and very funny suicides. And one of them he does for a blind date. She freaks out when he sets himself on fire, and so on. So anyway, a very fun movie from Hal Ashby. Hal Ashby had quite a good decade in the 1970s. The Last Detail with Jack Nicholson. He also had a pretty good decade coming off of Easy Rider. We have a Warren Beatty film, Shampoo, about a Beverly Hills hairdresser and all of the women he has floating around his orbit. And politics sort of enters the scene. It's the election night of 1968. Coming Home, about a man coming back from Vietnam War in a wheelchair and dealing with society, and his girlfriend, played by Jane Fonda. John Voight is the man, right? We know John Voight from Midnight Cowboy. And then the amazing film, and I have linked to this one, Being There, starring Peter Sellers. It's kind of a fairy tale. It's the oddest movie. He plays Chance, the gardener. Okay, like I say, it's kind of like a tale, fairy tale. Chance the gardener. He lives on the estate of a very rich man. He has a walled-in estate, so he doesn't deal with the outside world at all. He has a little house on the estate. The maids and cooks and so on cook him his meals and take care of his clothes. And he works in the garden and watches television. That's all he knows about life. And when the old man dies, they give him a suit of the old man's clothes, very nice tailored suit of the old man's clothes. And him being an idiot, he can't read or write or anything, but they make the point in the movie, he's a white man. He's white, and he's dressed well. And people are going to think that he is a lot more than he really is. So it's a satire for sure. And Peter Sellers does an amazing job of playing Chance the gardener. And of course, when he meets the rich lady in her limousine, they sort of bump into him and decide they're going to take him to the hospital. They have a private doctor and so on. So he works his way into there. And she thinks he's Chauncey Gardner, not Chance the gardener. And he's going to work his way up. By the end of the movie, he's advising the president and on the ticket as the vice president and so on. It's a very, very funny movie from Hal Ashby, Being There, and Peter Sellers again. Wonderful Peter Sellers. So I think you'll enjoy the trailer. There's the trailer. If you can track it down, it's a really good movie. All of these movies are great. They really are. And a brief introduction to Martin Scorsese, and he is part of that film school generation, New York University, back east, film school. He actually taught there for a little while, too. And he goes along with Francis Coppola and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and so on, that famed film school generation. And so he got a very interesting start in the 1970s, Mean Streets, low-level hoodlums and so on, and then Taxi Driver. He's going to play a Vietnam War vet, taxi driver, Travis Bickle. And that is kind of a trope, right? The troubled, the psychotic Vietnam War vet, the PTSD Vietnam War vet from Travis Bickle. We also have Rambo, Sylvester Stallone's Rambo, and we have Lethal Weapon, Mel Gibson, and lots of other troubled Vietnam War vets. And he is a taxi driver in New York City around the Times Square area. Today, the Times Square area, it's a wonderful place. It's very safe. It's like a downtown Disney or Universal City Walk. There are stores. There's a Disney store and an M&M store and lots of touristy things and police on horseback, and it's very well lit and very clean, and you'd think you're at downtown Disney or something like that. But in the 1970s, it was at its lowest depths. It's nadir. There was graffiti all over, broken windows, porno movie theaters, adult movie theaters, prostitutes, and a real scummy, scuzzy place. It's not like that anymore. If you get a chance to go, it's really nice. But back then it was an awful place. He's driving a taxi people are getting into the backseat of his cab and doing these awful things that he's going to have to clean up and so on later, and he just gets disgusted with society. He's going to snap and go after first a political candidate. He's going to decide not to do that. So instead of assassinating a political candidate, he's going to take out a pimp and drug dealer who's been pimping out a 12-year-old girl that he knows. So instead of being an assassin and a villain, he is a hero. He's a hero for saving this poor 12-year-old girl from, played by Jodie Foster, from this awful life that she has. So that's a pretty dark view, right? That's a pretty dark view of society, right? You could be an assassin, but for the flip of a coin, and he goes off to save this girl. And I've got the great "You Talking to Me" scene from Travis Bickle and Robert De Niro improvising a little bit. I think that came from an improvisation, and Scorsese liked it, and they kept it in the movie. We will dive much deeper into Scorsese in subsequent weeks when we talk about Raging Bull with De Niro again as a boxer, Jake LaMotta, and Goodfellas with De Niro again as a mobster, and then Wolf of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio, kind of a comedy, but still in New York City with drugs and whatever and all that kind of stuff. So briefly with Scorsese, we'll be back with him later on, and we'll also be back with Kubrick one more time when we talk about Vietnam War films. We are going to look at Full Metal Jacket in a couple when we get into the 80s. So that is it for today. Okay, a deep dive into Stanley Kubrick and 3 of his amazing films, and a brief introduction to Scorsese and a bit on Hal Ashby. He's really worth checking out. So more great stuff as we dive into the 1970s. We still have The Godfather and Godfather Part 2 and Chinatown, and lots of great stuff in the 1970s in the next class. So thank you so much, and see you then.